Hi everybody, this lecture is on rationalism within the field of epistemology. And so remember, one of the fundamental branches of philosophy is epistemology. It's the study of knowledge and how we really deal with the nature, sources, limitations, and validity of that knowledge. So how can we know when we actually know something? What is the criteria that we should have in order to gain knowledge? This is going to be the focus of this lecture. And so when we're asking what is knowledge, some common beliefs include the thing that I know must be true. Truth is knowledge. Wisdom is knowledge. Intelligence is knowledge. But what else? What does it mean when we suggest that we know something? If I tell you that I know the Earth is getting warmer, does it have to be true that the Earth is getting warmer? Do I have to actually believe it? Maybe I can just say something is true and not really believe it, but would that count as knowledge? Perhaps I need reasons, or even better yet, good reasons for believing something. And it's important to know, well, it's not going to be something that we discuss in this class. There's an aspect of value theory that intertwines with epistemology. In that, is it even valuable to have such an interest in the truth? Is there value in truth? And so the common accepted theory among philosophers today is that what it means to have knowledge is to have a justified true belief. And so when we are justified, when we have reasons that give us a belief, and that belief corresponds with reality and is therefore true, we can be said to have knowledge. Now, this is problematic, however, because we see in this video of the link provided that there are Gettier cases, these thought experiments espoused by Edmund Gettier, where a person has justified true belief, and yet we wouldn't necessarily count that as knowledge. And so watch the video, and at the 6-minute 48 mark, when they start talking about Gettier cases, ask yourself, in the situations presented, do you consider that knowledge? So a little background and history on epistemology. Really, it wasn't until the 17th and 18th century, when we get into the scientific revolution, when we get into the Enlightenment period, that we really start focusing on mathematical sciences, logical argumentation, observation, and experiments. Before then, especially in medieval time and prior, we see a shift from a more authoritarian based philosophy system where it was the ruling classes that really espoused philosophical ideas and understandings of the world, and really pushed those ideas. And it's not until the 17th and 18th century when we start getting a more general, rational, scientific based perspective on the world, where we start to rely more on experimentation and testing and reasoning rather than just musings of the ruling class. And so we're going to be starting off our journey in the next 2 weeks with 17th and 18th century philosophers, beginning with Descartes. And so there's going to be two focuses for the next couple weeks: rationalism and empiricism. Now, rationalism is the idea that knowledge arises through reason and deduction. Basically, I can know that something is true simply by sitting in my room and thinking about the innate ideas and the knowledge I can have through deductive reasoning. Now, empiricism argues against this, thinking that knowledge instead arises through our sense perception, through experiencing the world and induction, that no ideas are naturally innate to us. We're not born understanding anything. We're not born being able to rationalize. We can only even rationalize because of the experiences that we gain in the world and having experience, whether that's actually participating in some event or reading about something or seeing something, right? Just having some sense perception of that thing. And it's through the sense perception that we actually gain our knowledge. Rationalism often points to mathematics and logic as its reason-based knowledge. Again, it wouldn't seem as though I would necessarily need to experience the world to understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that all bachelors are unmarried. I would never have to know who a bachelor is or whether or not that person is unmarried to know that the proposition all bachelors are unmarried is true. I would simply need to know the definitions of the words, and through my deductive reasoning, I could infer that, in fact, all bachelors were unmarried, or that squares did not have 3 sides. These are not things that I would need to experience. I would only need to know terms and the definitions of terms in order to really understand and deduce knowledge from them. And so when rationalists claim that knowledge is based on reason rather than perception, they mean that they aren't relying on their experience. And as we'll see from Descartes, he's going to in fact try and wipe away his perception and experience of the world because of his belief that his perceptions can be constantly tricked and that he could always be wrong about those things that he's perceiving. So he's going to rely on rationality because our rationality can't be tricked. I can't be tricked into thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 5. My deductive reasoning tells me that that that's not the case, and it can't be. Same with all bachelors being unmarried, right? It's not the case that the world can actually throw out an oddball of a bachelor who is in fact married. That couldn't happen. It would be a logical contradiction. And so my rationality should give me knowledge based on the idea that I know what a bachelor is, I know what it means to be unmarried, and so I can definitively say that all bachelors are in fact unmarried. And so the rationalists will focus their attention on this reason rather than perception. Now, logic and mathematics are examples of what we refer to as a priori knowledge. Now, a priori knowledge is knowledge that is known independently of our sense perception. We don't need to experience something in order to know that it's true. So, for instance, the mathematician doesn't need to make observations whether theories are true or false. They're able to do the math and work it out. We see this a lot in physics when physicists or astrophysics, when astrophysicists will make predictions about um, eclipses, or they'll make predictions about space, and they won't even need to really look up at the stars in order to do it. They can just do it on a purely mathematical sense by working with the numbers. The numbers are telling us how the world will work. Um, so for something like this, we're not really needing the experience or the perception, right? I don't need to see an eclipse to know that eclipse is going to happen. I'm able to do it based purely on my knowledge of um, mathematics and laws of physics. Another example of a type of a priori knowledge would be something along the lines of you should keep your promises. If you believe that you should keep your promises, chances are it's not something um, that you're espousing based on experience, more of just, well, based on what it means to make a promise and the morality behind, well, if you promise to do something, you should uphold that promise. Um, Even if we've never had anyone break a promise to us, or if no one has made a promise to us, it would seem a bit odd for us to think that someone who's never been promised something wouldn't be able to understand or make a decision based on the idea of a promise. So if someone came up to you and you had no idea what a promise was, and they say, "Hey, I promise to do this for you," and you ask them, "Oh, what does that mean?" And they suggest, "Well, it means that I'm going to do this thing for you. I'm giving you my word that I'm going to do it." You would suggest, "Oh, yeah, I mean, if you're giving me your word, then yes, you should keep your promises, because apparently what it means to keep your promises is to be true to what it is that you're saying, and we shouldn't be false to what we're saying. We shouldn't lie. We shouldn't deceive." And so the idea that a person should keep their promise is something that should be known innately. It should be known rationally rather than through experience. The most famous of the rationalists, the one that we're going to focus on this week, is the French philosopher René Descartes. Now, René Descartes was a rationalist who aimed at trying to understand the world around him. And in order to do this, he needed to eliminate experience from what he knew. Descartes knew or experienced that his senses were tricked often. For instance, if you were to put a stick in water, the stick would look bent. And so, in order for Descartes to be certain about the world, what he did was he tried to really disregard everything he knew through experience and tried to build the world up out of rational propositions and understanding. So imagine Descartes sitting in his study, uh, refusing to accept anything through his senses. So the chair he was sitting in, the fireplace casting light and warmth into the room, the walls, the door, none of that stuff existed. And for Descartes, he needed to make sure that everything was real by using rational logic, by rationalizing everything into existence. And so he checked all of his ideas according to this idea of rationalism. You'll see in the video for this week that the analogy is used with a basket of apples. And just like a basket of apples where certain apples start to rot and the rot can spread to the rest of the apples in the basket, ideas do a very similar thing in the mind. And so if we were to dump out the basket of apples and check to see which ones were good to put them back so that only good apples were in the basket, Descartes tried to do the same thing with his ideas. He would empty out all his ideas about the world, accepting nothing as fact, and from that empty mind, try and bring ideas back one at a time so that he knew that everything that he believed was in fact true and accurate about the world. And so when he dumps out all his ideas about the world, all he's left with is the idea that he's thinking, right? And he's got these thoughts in his head. And this is where he gets into his uh, important cogito, I think, therefore I am, trying to build back up the world. If I can believe in nothing else, all I can believe in is that I'm thinking right now. And if I'm thinking, then I must exist. And so, from the nothingness, Descartes is able to bring himself out as a thinking being. So, Descartes sets out on a three-step method of doubt to really be skeptical about the information that he brings back into his apple basket, as it were. And so he wants to attack his sensory data, attack his senses. Nothing can be taken for granted. I cannot just assume just because my door sits in front of me and leads to the hallway that I'm actually visually seeing my door, that my door is there. Instead, I want only the good, only the rational ideas, the ideas that are certain to me to be the ones that I let back in. And so, what Descartes does is he perceives of this evil deceiver, uh, um, a being that exists to constantly deceive him, so that nothing that he thinks about the world can be things that he can be that so nothing that he thinks about the world can be trusted except for that information that is rational, that is uh, factually presented to him in his mind alone and not through sense data or that empiricism. And so this evil deceiver plays a big role in Descartes' meditations and his philosophy of knowledge and metaphysics and his philosophy of mind, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. So think of this evil deceiver as someone who is constantly trying to trick you into believing things that aren't true. Again, my doorway sits in front of me and leads to the hall. But perhaps the evil deceiver is putting this image in front of me and makes me think that it's leading to the hall when really it's not. Or we have different objects around the room. I have a computer or a television. These things are placed in my head, and for me to know that my TV is here is just the deceiver putting that idea in front of me. Even if I were to try and verify that the TV were there and turn it on, again, all of this is being deceived by the deceiver. Think back to this idea of the matrix and understanding that, well, the world that I'm living in could be a shell of the actual world deep inside of some sort of matrix like reality. So, if this is the case and there's this deceiver that's constantly out there to trick me, then how is it that I'm going to acquire any knowledge? How am I going to get any of these apples back into the basket so that I can be said to know information and be confident and guaranteed that that information is known? Again, this is where we get his cogito of I think, therefore I am. Even if he's being tricked, even if he's dreaming, even if the evil deceiver is putting ideas into Descartes' head, he's still thinking. And as a thinking thing, he is an agent that is doing this work. And so, what Descartes can extrapolate from this world, this empty world of deception, is that he is a thinking agent. And so we can be clear and distinct about something. We can be clear about the idea that I exist because a thinking thing exists. If there is thought, there must be a thinker. If I am thinking, I must exist. And so this idea, this distinct idea of uh, understanding his own existence is distinguished from other things of his perception. I can't perceive of my desk, of my water, of my television, but I can perceive, I can understand my own existence through the idea that if there is thought, there must be a thinker. And so for Descartes, this clarity and distinctness marks certainty. And this is what he's trying to obtain to understand what it means to know something exists. So for Descartes, he is going to use this as a stepping stone for building up the rest of the universe around him. If he exists in the world, then he can use that and continually rationalize piece after piece until he can build back up the world around us. Because Descartes probably willing to understand or probably understands that the majority of the world around him is in fact real. I don't want anyone to think that, oh, this is some psychopath who didn't believe in the house that he was living in. Surely he believed that the things were there, right? He's not sitting in his study, sticking his head in his fireplace, looking through his chimney while the fireplace is going. He understands the reality of the things. However, he's trying to eliminate the waste. He's trying to eliminate those toxic and rotten ideas that'll spread. And so his aim is to almost build up the world around him so that it seems very similar to the world he has known, except with the rotten ideas wiped away. And so he does this by first thinking of himself as an existing thing, and then from there moves on to the idea of God and this supremely perfect being. This understanding of God is something that Descartes can't have through his senses. We don't experience God in the way that we experience uh, our family or a stuffed animal. Instead, we experience God through the idea. God must have put this idea of a perfect being into our head. And so Descartes thinks that by believing in God, believing in the supremely perfect being, then we can start to understand the world around us. Because if God is this omnibenevolent, omniscient, uh, omnipotent creator, then by his being perfect, he wouldn't be a deception. God couldn't deceive us. So this idea of God must be real because a evil deceiver that tried to deceive us would not be of this perfect stature, but God would be. And so Descartes has this idea of God, namely that he's this infinite being, and this can't come from science because science is finite. Science uh, can be tested, experimented. Science can be sensed through our experience. It can be hypothesized. God, on the other hand, is this infinite creature, and even understanding the idea of an infinite being kind of is difficult to wrap our heads around. Um, in infinity, even just thinking of the number infinity is quite problematic. And so for Descartes, thinking of an infinite being can't come from a finite world because an infinite being is so much more than what science can even begin to explain. Science quantifies information, it understands information, and the nature of infinity is that it can't be understood. And so that must come from outside myself, according to Descartes. So this idea of God has to be placed within me, an innate idea that resides within me, uh, placed by something else. And this something else we're not going to think of as the deceiver, as we'll get to in the next slide. And he thinks about this based on an argument that's espoused by St. Thomas Aquinas, um, 600 years prior to Descartes. And it's really the idea of a principle of sufficient reason. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his 5 ways where he tries to prove the existence of God, expresses the argument that God exists because everything has a cause. And essentially, if everything has a cause, then the effect that's taking place must have a cause, and then that cause must have a cause, and that cause must have a cause. And we can't go on reducing causes infinitely because, again, remember, an infinite is not um, an idea that we can really wrap our heads around. And so there must be some starting point where there's a creator. And so if everything has a sufficient cause or reason, that reason then is going to have a reason, and that reason is going to have a reason, and we're going to continue to go back until there is one thing that creates the reason or the existence of everything else, and that thing is God. And so whatever is the cause of a thing must be adequate to explain that thing in nature, which is the principle of adequate reality. If God exists, God is infinite, he can then create or is the sufficient cause. He is the reason behind everything else. And from him, everything gains its nature, everything gains its existence. And so Descartes is going to latch on to this idea of the principle of sufficient reason, which again is a theory that goes back, even dates back to the ancient Greeks. And from this, he's going to rationalize this idea of God. And again, we can do this purely through rationality. We don't need experience. If I see something, for instance, if we look at one of Aquinas' other arguments, the arguments through change or through motion, if I see something moving through space, it must be the case that something has acted on that thing to move it through space. So let's say I see a baseball flying through the air. I can rewind time to see someone throwing or hitting that baseball. And when I see someone throwing or hitting that baseball, I can rewind and see them making the decision to throw, their arm moving through space or time. And so everything is acting on something else. And if we continually rewind backwards, we have to come to a point where there is a first motion, where there is a first cause. In physics, we typically thought of that time as being the Big Bang, but even now, it seems as though that doesn't really do justice in explaining where everything came from. And so physicists have proposed other theories, Big Crunch or string theory, that there are other universes that have collided, creating our universe. But you'll see in each instance you have something moving because something else has caused it. And Descartes and Aquinas are going to say that, well, we can't go on infinitely reducing this. We need to have a first cause, because otherwise things would just have moved forever, and forever scientifically there are problems with that. It doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense when you actually play out what it means for the infinite to go back infinitely. And so they're going to use this, Descartes' going to use this as a bridge for suggesting that, well, in addition to myself, God must exist as well. Now, we can put this up to the test of the evil deceiver, but we can see through the liar paradox that a deceiver would run into problems when it comes to uh, the idea of a perfect being. So, for instance, let's say we have the evil demon is an infinite being and an infinite liar, someone who is constantly trying to get us to mistake what it is that we experience for knowledge. If a being always lied, then it wouldn't make sense. We would have a contradiction because anyone that lied all the time, if you had this being that was constantly deceiving, that being would run into problem by the sense of uttering a sentence like, this sentence is false. By suggesting that this sentence is false, you're either saying something that's true or the sentence is false, but then therefore it makes it true. So the liar's paradox would show that the evil deceiver couldn't be perfect in being a deceiver. And so the only thing that even could be perfect is a perfect being. There is no paradox when it comes to an infinite truth teller. There are no contradictions that arise from telling the truth, only from lying and misleading. And so if I'm imagining this perfect being, I know that this perfect being must be good, because to suggest that the perfect being was perfectly bad would suggest that this being would be a contradiction and therefore couldn't exist because of its imperfections. This idea of having a clear and distinct idea of the world is really what Descartes focuses on as a test for whether or not he's willing to accept something as knowledge. So the point where Descartes applies his ideas to something outside of themselves, or a sense or dissents from propositions, um, that's the internal will that's really having these clear and distinct ideas. This is not understanding in the experiential or perceptive stance. Uh, Understanding something is very limited, and we as humans sometimes feel as though our ability to know is quite limited. But the soul for Descartes, and the soul is something that is going to play an important part later on in Descartes' theory, is something that's unlimited. It's something, again, innate, given to us by God, something that we can rationalize through the existence of God. And so his ideas are clear and distinct when he knows that they can't be deceived. They're safe in terms of uh, the judgments that he makes. He's trying to say that the idea that I think, therefore I am is clear and distinct because I know I can't be deceived by the idea that uh, I think, therefore I am. The same goes with the understanding of God and him having to be a perfect being, because him being a perfect deceiver would lead to a logical contradiction, and we can rationalize God's existence through the mere rationality of the infinite reduction of necessary and sufficient causes, or rather, uh, suggesting that the series of necessary and sufficient causes uh, can't be infinitely reduced. There needs to be a starting point. There needs to be someone to get the ball rolling, as it were. So for Descartes, it's important that we come to knowledge through clear and distinct ideas, because these ideas won't be ideas that are spoiled. They won't be rotten by faulty perceptions of the world. The process of gaining these clear and distinct ideas are something that is generally apparent to us. We become aware of them as if recalling a memory. Innate ideas are those things that we think about where there doesn't seem to need to be proof or experience to understand them. Instead, we just know of them purely through the will, purely through our soul. Um, and those things include the mind and God and even material bodies, which remember, if we can create God and then God can create the world around us, then we can be certain of our surroundings and we can be more confident in the things that we perceive, even though our perceptions can trick us. And so for Descartes, he really wants to focus on this rationality of innate ideas and the clear and distinct nature that things have as they're presented to us innately rather than through experience of them. Now, of course, this theory isn't without its problems. Rationalism itself, without its problems, there are a lot to go around. Uh, so if at any point in this lecture or the readings you felt a bit skeptical about some of the things that were being espoused by Descartes, fair enough. There are a lot to go around. First is this idea of the principle of sufficient reason. So if for Descartes, he relies on this idea of the principle of sufficient reason, where everything must have a reason, everything must have a cause. However, Descartes never seems to hold up this idea as one in which the evil deceiver can take part in. He just assumes that the principle of sufficient reason is innate, is obvious, is true. But really, we can question this idea of the principle of sufficient reason. We can question the idea of something needing to cause something else. So, for instance, if we have the principle of sufficient reason, everything must be caused by something else until you get down to a God, because you can't have a infinite reduction of causes. This is something that is questioned even in physics today, and whether or not the universe is infinite or not. If in fact the universe is infinite, if matter is infinite, then we can imagine a world where everything has a cause and there's no end to the causes, because perhaps we live in a closed circuit universe where instead of thinking of a timeline, a linear timeline, we think of a timeline that's more cyclical in nature. And so things cause other things, those things cause other things, and so forth, and we end up moving in a circle. So you don't really need a first thing or a first cause. So this idea of Descartes that the principle of sufficient reason is somehow a stepping stone for understanding God, which then creates the rest of reality, well, that itself is problematic, and it doesn't seem as though Descartes really holds that um, principle of sufficient reason up to the skeptical deceiver, and just kind of assumes that that is the case when I don't think it's necessarily the case that it is. It certainly is something that's been questioned and that we constantly question today in physics. You also get the problem with his cogito of I think, therefore I am. Now, with I think, therefore I am, it becomes a bit problematic in the sense that just because he thinks doesn't necessarily mean he exists. Again, if you're trying to believe that there's an evil deceiver out there constantly deceiving someone, to suggest that I'm thinking is an assumption that I myself am doing the thinking, when in fact it could be the deceiver that's doing the thinking, and therefore making the jump from me thinking to me existing wouldn't necessarily be a good jump to make. Instead, Descartes can simply say, I think, therefore I think, or, uh, but even then, that we're attaching the I with think. And if we're really holding the evil deceiver to his job, then it could be the case that it's the evil deceiver thinking and not you, because you don't exist. It's the deceiver that's having this conversation, having these thoughts with himself. So again, looking at the principle of sufficient reason, we can look at some physicalist accounts of the Higgs boson, the God particle, or quantum indeterminacy, to suggest that in reality, the idea that matter has a necessary cause or effect isn't the case. We can see with quantum indeterminacy certain pieces of matter actually can jump from one place to another and be in two places at once, and it's not quite sure that there is a cause or effect to these two types of particles being in the same place, or how they can jump through space and time. And so it could be the case that, well, this principle of sufficient reason is not held up uh, to the evil deceiver, and therefore we shouldn't assume that it's necessarily true. And then also that this cogito doesn't necessarily accurately capture what it means for me to be thinking, when in fact it could be the deceiver that's doing the thinking too. And so these are two of the big problems that Descartes is going to have to overcome, because rationalizing the world, it would seem as though if we really had this deceiver who was trying to be skeptical of everything and trying to deceive us, he'd be able to do so even with Descartes' most basic assumptions of the I think, therefore I am. Wrapping up this week, just a couple of final thoughts about rationalism and epistemology. Trying to understand the world is something that is quite difficult. And before we even can make our claims about what exists and what doesn't exist, we really need to focus our attention on what is our criteria for knowing? How is it that we learn and know something so that we can be confident that what we're expressing is true? Can we ever be confident? Could we ever know things about the world, or will we always have to be skeptical? Now, there are some skeptics out there, not skeptics as in you guys are skeptics, maybe you are, maybe you're not, but skeptics like David Hume, who is the one of the biggest skeptics of philosophy, who believe that we really couldn't know anything about the world, and we shouldn't necessarily claim that we know anything. We can just get to, let's say, 90% of what we think, or we can just get to a point where, oh yeah, we can get by in the world okay, but really we don't know anything, and there's no point of even trying to gain this full understanding. But Descartes is going to argue with that and suggest, well, no, we know through our rationality. And Locke next time is going to argue, no, we can know, but it's through experience that we know it. And so for this week, I ask that you think to yourself what it means for you to know something. When you suggest that you have information, uh, when you tell a friend, or when you know something and impart that knowledge on someone else, what does it mean for you to really know that?